Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is promising to be a most interesting discussion about a subject that has so many layers and so much nuance that we don't have practically enough time to discuss everything in detail, so I'm going to get right down to it. Beginning with Abhay K, you want to introduce your book first?
Well, this is the new book, Nalanda, How It Changed the World. We have it today. I mean, today is actually the official launch. So you can see it. I mean, someone said, I think it was, who said that launch is something. So, I'm going to tell you a little about Nalanda. How did the university originate? So, most of us actually know about the ruins of Nalanda, but we don't really know that when did actually the foundations of this great monastery university begin. And the beginning happens actually at the time of Buddha himself. And Buddha spends lots of time in Rajgarh, which is the first capital of Magadha, and goes to Nalanda, which has a lovely mango grove with lots of shades, a pond full of lotus, and a serpent lives in that lotus. And that serpent, you can see on the cover of this book, that serpent is called Nalanda. That's one of the legends about Nalanda told by the Chinese traveler Xuanzang. But fast forward 300 years later, in 3rd century BCE, when Ashoka, the Emperor Ashoka, he embraces Buddhism, and he goes to Nalanda and builds a stupa for Buddha's first male disciple, Sariputra. And Sariputra's stupa is actually the nucleus around which first a Buddhist vihara is also founded by Ashoka. And that becomes the nucleus for the growth of the Mahavihara. And this journey from vihara from 3rd century BCE to 5th century AD, when vihara becomes Mahavihara, that's the journey which most of us do not know about. You have the great Nagarjuna, the great philosopher in the 1st century AD, who in a way can be considered the real founder of the software of Nalanda, the philosophy of Madhyamaka or Sunyata. It's called Sunyavad, which becomes the foundation for Nalanda's growth. And by 5th century AD, Nalanda is a full-fledged university. It's there in this journey from Vihara to Mahavihara. Actually, the idea of university itself is born. Universities we know today, the ancient places which we know as Oxford, Cambridge, and University of Bologna, they come much later in 12th century AD. William has written a lot about this in his book, The Golden Road. But this is the origin of Nalanda.
Thank you so much, Abhay, for sort of laying the ground for us there. I want to come back to Xuanzang here because, William, in your book, The Golden Road, you have a chapter on Nalanda which sort of opens with this young man who's crossing the wastes of the Taklamakan desert, and he's doing so very much in peril of his own life. He's bound for India, he's bound for Nalanda. You tell us a bit more about Xuanzang and what brought him here. What was the lure of Nalanda?
So Xuanzang is an extraordinary source, not just for Nalanda, but for early India. We know from archaeology, from the fragments of sculpture and epigraphy and buildings and architecture which survive, of the extraordinary achievements in ancient India. But so much of ancient Indian history is lost in terms of names, in terms of history, in terms of biography and personalities. You can go through periods of hundreds of years when all you have is a few potsherds and some wonderful coins. And then you have these miraculous moments when it's as if suddenly the lights go on. and you can see everything. And Xuanzang is that supreme moment in Indian history. He is a Chinese traveler. He is a nerd. He's someone that really wants to get Buddhist monasticism right. And he's convinced that the texts he's using in 7th century China are corrupted, that the translations are imperfect, and that some of the most important texts, by which he's thinking of the Yogacara texts, are simply absent completely. He's read other accounts of these texts, but he travels from monastery to monastery at a very dangerous time when the dynasty which is ruling is falling. The Tang dynasty has yet to properly establish itself. So he's dodging brigands, he's moving often away from bandits, but from monastery library to monastery library, and cannot find the texts he needs. So at a time when it could not be more difficult, when it is illegal to leave the country or to travel to the western deserts, because that's where the bandits are, and the government is determined to stop any unnecessary civilian traffic in and out of those areas, he decides to walk to India, to Nalanda, to the center of learning in Asia at that period. And he writes very clearly this sentence, which is something that we should always remember. People of distant places with diverse customs generally designate the land they most admire as India. Thanks to colonialism, ancient India's reputation is far lower in the wider world than, say, the reputation of ancient Greece. Every child in the West is brought up with Pythagoras. They can tell you the story of Archimedes in his bath and Eureka by the age of 6 or 7. But virtually no one in Europe or America or Africa or Australia has ever heard of names like Aryabhatta or Brahmagupta. Likewise, China, which is another country which has this extraordinary history of civilization, has been very good at teaching its story. And if you go to London today, you'll find not one but 2 exhibitions about the Silk Road, which is alleged to be this road which runs from east to west, bringing learning, art, and commerce with it. And it travels way to the north of India, and it terminates at Xi'an. In reality, in the classical period, it was not China, but India that was the center of the world's networks of trade, learning, civilization, and culture. And we can prove this by looking at, for example, the Roman coin hoards. There are no Roman coins in China because Rome and China were completely unaware of each other's existence. But Rome and India were in daily and annual contact with fleets of 250 vessels sailing between the two. And it is to India that Xuanzang goes to look for learning. He's never heard of the Library of Alexandria, but he has heard of the great library of Nalanda. And what we get with Xuanzang is a double barrel, because we don't just get his own account, which survives completely intact of his own travels, and written very soon after he returned, when his mind has not begun forgetting the details. But on top of that, we get his own biographer, Hugh Lee, who writes another account towards the end of his life, and which circulates immediately after his death, which gives an even fuller account of Nalanda. And can I read just a little?
Yes, yes.
Section. This is Hugh Lee describing Nalanda, just to give you a visual picture. Because the entire complex was constructed by kings of successive dynasties, the buildings were erected by the most exquisitely skilled carpenters, employing rare tools such as curved chisels, making the complex a really magnificent sight. 6 kings built as many monasteries around the site, one after another, and an enclosure was made with bricks to merge them all into one monastery with one common entrance. There were separate courtyards divided with 8 departments. Precious terraces ranged like stars in the sky, and jade-storied pavilions spired like lofty peaks. The temples rose high in the mist, and the shrines hovered in those rosy clouds. Breeze and fog rose from the windows and doors, and the sun and moon shone alternately on the eaves of the buildings. Moreover, brooks of clear water meandered the compounds with blue lotuses and water lilies growing inside them. The flowers of sandalwood trees glowed inside the enclosure, and outside there was a dense mango orchard, the same mango orchards which were there at the time of the Buddha. All the monks' chambers in the different departments had 4 stories. The ridgepoles were carved with little dragons, and the beams were painted all the colors of the rainbow. And green struts contrasted with crimson pillars. Very bright colors like Tibetan monasteries today. So that's the sort of image we should be thinking of. The frontal columns and railings had ornamental engravings and hollowed out carvings. The plinths were made of jade, and the tips of the rafters were adorned with drawings. The ridges of the roof stood high in the sunlight, and the eaves were connected with ropes from which hung colored silk pennants. In India, there were thousands of monasteries, but this was the most magnificent and sublime of them all. And Xuanzang then gives us a kind of idea from his account of the lecture halls, stupas, 5 temples, and successive courtyards, each full of 300 individual apartments, which housed 10,000 monks and scholars. Between them, they studied the different texts of Mahayana and Nikaya Buddhism, as well as Vedas, logic, Sanskrit, grammar, philosophy, medicine, metaphysics, divination, mathematics, astronomy, literature, and magic. The priests, to the number of several thousands, are men of the highest ability and talent, wrote Xuanzang. Their distinction is very great at the present time. The rules of this convent are severe, and all the priests are bound to observe them. The day is not sufficient for asking and answering profound questions. From morning until night, they engage in discussions. The old and the young mutually help each other. Lectures are given in 100 different halls each day, and the students study diligently without wasting a single moment. All the monks who lived there were men of virtue, and the atmosphere of the monastery was naturally solemn and dignified. So what this picture shows us is Xuanzang, arriving from China, thinks that he's arrived in the center of civilization when he arrives at Nalanda. And no kid has ever been more thrilled to arrive at university than Xuanzang arriving at Nalanda. He's dazzled by it. And 20 years later, he's writing this down with this sort of, it's obviously a very gilded picture, but it indicates how, for him, this was the center. This was the very center of the world which he wanted to commit himself to.
So before I come to you, Shailendra, I want Abhay to sort of fill in a little more about what the average day was for a student.
Before that, I just wanted to, how was Xuanzang treated at Nalanda when he arrived there? So servants had been instructed by the Mahavihara to look after every comfort of Xuanzang, making him feel at home in Nalanda. After he had rested, he was granted an audience with Silabhadra, the head of the university, during which he expressed the reason for his travel to India, to learn Yogachara, and then he requested Silabhadra to accept him as his disciple. Whereupon, following the rest, he entered to salute this eminent person. Having seen him, then the chief almoner presented him with all things necessary without stint. After the conversation, the master took his leave. Xuanzang, master means Xuanzang, because it's being written by his biographer. He was lodged on the 4th story of the house of Buddha Bhadra in the courtyard of the monastery built by King Baladitya. When the 7 days entertainment was over, he was again lodged in the main chamber to the north of the house of Dharmapala with an increase in provisions. He was provided daily with borneol incense and 1 sheng of Mahasali rice. A grain of this rice was bigger than a black bean, and when cooked, it had a fragrance of delicious taste that no other kind of rice possessed of this quality. This kind of non-glutinous rice was produced only in Magadha and was now found elsewhere. as it was supplied only to kings and learned monks of virtue. It was called rice supplied to great persons. He was also given a monthly supply of 3 sheng of oil, and as regards butter and milk, he could take as much as he needed every day. The master of law was also provided with a servant and an elephant which could take him across the monastery.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to now come to you, Shailendra. William and Abhay have laid a very visual and graphic context for what was happening at Nalanda and what it looked like. I want you to bring us sort of closer to home. I want you to tell us about what the atmosphere overall closer to home was that allowed for a center of learning like Nalanda to come up as it did.
Right. So I think the most important thing to understand, and here I'm building on what both Abhay and William have talked about, the thing that is important to realize is that a center like Nalanda does not appear out of nowhere. There was at least 1,000 years of learning that had preceded Nalanda. In particular, before Nalanda, there was a huge center of learning that we are all aware of, but kind of dimly aware of, and that was Takshashila, or as the Greeks called it, Taxiles, or as in English we call it, Takshashila. Now, if you go there, and I've actually had the pleasure of being there, I believe William has been there as well, it is kind of interesting. For an Indian, one needs a visa not just for the country, and I've been there many times, I've been to Karachi many times, I've done lots of programs there, but I had to specifically request a visa for Islamabad, because Takshashila is a suburb of Islamabad. It's like what Gurugram is to Delhi, right? It's on a road which we today call the Grand Trunk Road, but it was not built by Sher Shah Suri as most people imagine. It was actually built by Chandragupta Maurya to connect 2 parts of his empire, the 2 capital cities, Patliputra, which was close to Rajgir, and Takshashila, which was the other capital city. And so he built a road 2,300 years ago that was called Uttarapath, or simply the Northern Road. So the Northern Road connected these 2 great administrative capitals of Chandragupta Maurya. Now, Takshashila was not just an administrative capital, it was also the learning center in the world at that time. Now, I'm talking about 3rd century BC. But Nalanda had been formed, the educational environment basically dates from the 6th century BC. We know this from the Buddhist texts, the Jataka stories, and also from the Greek texts from Plutarch and others, that it was a flourishing center for education. And the reason for that is that the 3 great roads, Uttarapath I've already talked about, the what is now called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or the Silk Road, that basically connected Takshashila to China and Xi'an. And then in the west, Takshashila was connected via the Persian Royal Road all the way up to Greece. So really, the reason why Takshashila was important is because it was the global meeting point. The 3 great roads connecting all the great civilizations of Eurasia at that time met in Takshashila. So Takshashila was not only a commercial hub, but it was also the intellectual hub. Now, so then how does Takshashila feed into Nalanda? A very interesting question, and there you need to go into a little bit of geopolitics. So let me now take you back to 300 years after the founding, after Chandragupta Maurya. This is now the turn of the millennium, the first millennium. And now there's a big migration from Central Asia to India, and they are known by different names in different countries. In India, they're known as the Hunas. In English, they're known as the Huns. The Chinese called them the Xiongnu. The Greeks called them Heptalites. And there are many different names, but essentially they were the Huns. And they were displaced, and by the way, they also attack Europe. So they come to India, and the first set of Huns who settled here are the Kushans. We've all heard of Kanishka. And essentially that lasts from about, let us say, 0 to 300 AD. Then a second wave comes in. They are called the Kidarites. They last from about 330 to about 450. And then a fourth wave comes, and these are what are called the Alkon Huns. In Sanskrit, they are called Lakhana, and essentially they devastate Takshashila. When Sun Yun, I believe in 520, visits Takshashila, he says the king there was a barbarian, he was hated by everybody, and he was Toramana, most likely, one of the Alcon Huns. So essentially, the White Huns have destroyed Takshashila, and they've come all the way up to Mathura and Vidisha and Ujjain, and they're wreaking havoc everywhere in India. So starting with Samudragupta, there's a massive pushback from the Gupta Empire. Samudragupta, then Kumaragupta, who's also called Baladitya Gupta, and others, they all basically fight a series of battles, and essentially the Huns are subdued. But along the way, the Guptas realized that Takshashila is not viable anymore. And when I went to Takshashila, it was very interesting. My guides said, "Sahab, aap 6 baje ke baad yahan mat aiye, yahan bahut dahshat hoti hai." After 6 o'clock, even today, if you go to Takshashila, they will say, "Please don't stay here. It's Wild West. You know, it's lawless territory. Even today, it's Taliban territory." So essentially, for the last 1,500 years, that place has not really known peace. So the Guptas were very clear that a center of learning could not be supported in that part of the country. So essentially, that is the reason why Kumaragupta, somewhere around 425 or 427 AD, converts the Sangharam, which is what Abhay was talking about, into the Mahavihara, or the University of Nalanda. And after that, as William then pointed out, 6 Gupta emperors supported Nalanda, including Baladitya, who was kind of very interesting. Baladitya, his name was Narasimha Gupta also. He ruled from 495 to 510. Now, the reason why I want to mention that is because he did something which is quite unusual by world standards. Well, actually, it was done before. Chandragupta Maurya did that. He steps down as king, and then he decides to enter Nalanda. This is a story that is not very well known, but he decides to enter Nalanda, but he does not become a monk. And then there's a dilemma. So where does he rank in the hierarchy? Because in Nalanda, the rule was very simple. It was what was called your seniority was not determined by your age. It was determined by your Sangha Ayu. That is, when were you initiated into the Sangha? So if 2 people, one was older, but initiated later, he would rank lower in the hierarchy. But now, where do you fit the king? Right? He comes in, he's not a monk, but he wants to join Nalanda. Probably he wants to spend the rest of his life basically learning, meditation or what have you. But where do you fit him? So then they said, okay, we certainly can't put you in the same category as monks. You will always rank below the monks. Even the junior most monk will be above you. But as a consolation prize, we will rank you as number 1 amongst the lay students of Nalanda. By the way, Nalanda did not only have monks, they had 2 other categories of students called Manavas and Brahmacharis. Manavas were those who were monks in training but not yet monks. And Brahmacharis were those who did not want to be monks. They were people like you and me who wanted to go to Nalanda and essentially then go on, as Xuanzang said, and Huili in particular, steal the name of Nalanda, which essentially meant a degree. Once you had a Nalanda degree, you could literally go anywhere in the world and basically present yourself as a scholar, and then you would have a job. So that is extremely important to understand. And then perhaps in the second round, when we come back, we'll have some other stories about Nalanda. But only when you understand the broader ecosystem. India had this massive ecosystem of learning, which is what I'm in the process of documenting right now. So the story behind the story. We've all heard about Nalanda. We are going to hear a lot more about Takshashila. But even behind that, there's a huge process of evolution, of scholarship, of state support, of respect for education, and so many other factors that basically made India what it was, which was the center of the universe when it came to learning. And by the way, it's not just the Chinese who are saying this. This shocked me, that it's the Greeks who are also saying that it's not the Greeks who are the centers of learning for the Greeks, it's the Indians. And one of the famous dialogues in one of the Greek texts is really about how the goddess of philosophy first lands in India and has a beautiful reception. And then she goes to Babylon, and then she goes to Syria, and then she goes to many other places, and ultimately comes to Greece. And she has a terrible reception there. So even the Greeks, in particular, were very clear that when it came to learning and when it came to philosophy, and this is Lucianus, by the way, and I've pulled out the Greek fragment, and I'm going to translate it as part of my book. And by the way, it's very interesting. And you need to understand this, because I think this is another theme as to why we missed all this. There are two versions of Lucianus, right? You can check it out in the Oxford series or in the Harvard series. Now, the Harvard series is by a Yale professor, and he translates this line that the goddess of philosophy lands in India, the mightiest nation on earth, right? The term that she uses is mega, right? The mightiest nation on earth. But that's in Greek. But the Harvard translation translates the mightiest as the most populous. Can you imagine? This is what you call death by translation, right? So now, fortunately, the Oxford translation is correct. It says India was the mightiest nation. This is the goddess of philosophy who's telling Zeus in Greece. And so every Greek person, including Alexander, who actually got there, and perhaps Pythagoras also, they all wanted to come to Takshashila to have a dialogue with the philosophers. And it's really this tradition of philosophy that basically gave rise to Nalanda.
There's a lovely story that when Alexander arrives in Takshashila, I think it's Strabo, much later, who writes this down, that the gymnosophists, which is what the Greeks call presumably the sadhus or the Jain monks, they were stark naked. And they refused to give any of their learning to the Greeks until the Greeks stripped off. And a long argument takes place. But eventually they do. They realize they're not going to get anywhere unless they get their kit off. So they do strip off. And Alexander is allowed to keep his boots on or something. There's some concession. But it is extraordinary. We have grown up in a world that does not recognize the primacy of ancient Indian learning. And it's all there in the sources. You only have to dig it out. And it's extraordinary that in the 21st century that most of the world just does not know this.
So, I mean, a follow-up question, because what you were saying was deeply interesting. You're talking about this whole atmosphere of academic freedom and, rigors of admission into Nalanda. What was the sort of link between, or was there any, between the university and the state? Was there any political interference in how a university functioned?
So a little bit of background to her question. I've been working on this project of the ancient Indian universities for about 12 years. And my wife and son are here somewhere. They've been pressing me to write this for ages. And the reason why I have desisted is because I wanted to answer several questions, big questions that I couldn't, in right conscience, write a book about ancient Indian centers of learning without answering those questions. And one big question that I had was, what was so special about India that we had universities, but the rest of the world didn't have it? Now, it's not that they didn't try to have universities. China built quite a few of them. If you look at the
Xuanzang's grandfather was the rector
yes.
of the Xi'an University.
Yes, yeah. of the university where they trained the mandarins or the civil servants. But these universities did not last very long, because when the new emperor came, he would, with one exception, I think out of the 846 rulers that they've had in China, only one was a woman. So they all said, basically, off with their heads. Any scholar who did not agree with their ideology would be either imprisoned or beheaded, and the books would literally be burnt. And by the way, it was the same in the Arab world. Saladin, for example, came to Al-Azhar, had been set up, but Saladin burnt the books in Al-Azhar. If you go to the Encyclopedia of Islam, the previous edition, not this current one, you will see the full details of how there were massive episodes of book burning that happened. So when you have something like this, it's very difficult to sustain something on a long-term basis that will perpetuate learning, in a center of learning. By contrast, in Nalanda, they freely criticized each other and all doctrines, whether or not they had the support of the state.
I just wanted to add here.
Please.
Monks of all major and minor Buddhist sects, as well as non-Buddhists, came to study at Nalanda Mahavihara and engaged in debates and discussion, as Xuanzang notes above. Nalanda became a peaceful battleground for various philosophical strands, ideas and thoughts, sects and creeds who engaged in arguments and scholarly debates. Despite acrimonious and animated debates and discussions, Nalanda never witnessed any violence among its monks. Xuanzang tells his disciple Willi, the priests dwelling here as a body naturally or spontaneously, a dignified and grave, so that during the 700 years of foundation of the establishment, there has not been a single case of rebellion against the rules. Intellectual and philosophical differences were a cause of celebration at Nalanda, and monks had the freedom of thought, expression, and belief. The Mahavihara provided an atmosphere of freedom and tolerance where any dispute could be settled through debate. This marked the first step in the process of scientific inquiry, laying the foundations of science in the first millennia. The winners of these debates were acclaimed universally.
William, the library at Nalanda was unparalleled. Do you want to tell us about
This
that?
is the thing that excites Xuanzang the most. He's traveled by foot all the way from China, through the Gobi Desert, over the Pamirs, through Kashmir, survived robbers and attempted to sacrifice him, and various other horrors. And the reason is the library. That's what draws him, that and Silabhadra. Yeah, and he says, it was 9 stories high. That's more or less what the Cambridge UL is. Think of the tower there. And it contained 3 divisions. The Ratna Dadi, the Sea of Jewels, the Ratna Sagara, the Ocean of Jewels, and the Ratna Rajaka, the Jewel Adorned. Any manuscript could be borrowed. The Nalanda regulations held that it must be stored in the niche in the monk's cell next to the square central courtyard.
Let me add a fascinating story. There are many great classical languages in the world, and we talk about Sanskrit, we talk about Persian, Arabic, Chinese, but another great classical language is Tibetan. And the foundations of modern Tibetan studies were laid by an intrepid explorer by the name of Rahul Sankrityayan, one of the greatest scholars ever in any language, in any country, at any time. And he's not more appreciated or admired because every one of his books, and he knew Russian, French, German, Latin, Sanskrit, Pali, Prakrit, Chinese, all of these languages. He wrote 200 books. They're all in Hindi. 1 or 2 have been translated in English. But he did something intrepid, which I think I need to mention in the context of the library. He got 20 mule loads. He went to Tibet. He learned Tibetan. And he went to the different monasteries. And he persuaded, basically, in search of texts which were lost in Sanskrit, but were available, Sanskrit in India, but were available in either Tibetan translation or Sanskrit original in the monasteries. So literally, he got monastery after monastery, the storerooms opened up, and he went into the dusty archives, and he pulled out, and he had a good equation with the monks. And he came back to India in multiple visits and got 20 mule loads of scriptures. I had the good fortune of seeing that whole collection. He got 7,500 manuscripts from Tibet back to India. This is now 100 years ago. And they were all there in the Patna Museum at that time. This was about 10 years ago. And unfortunately, the last person who curated them had retired 30 years prior to that, and then passed away 10 years prior to that. So nobody was going to read. Of course, there are lots of people who read it elsewhere. and they are now being brought into the new Nalanda Mahavihar and into the new
I'm
Patna
sorry
Museum.
to sort of come in.
Yes.
I do want, at some point, this floor to be opened
Yes.
up to audience. So I want...
So that is part of the library. So the only part, last line, some of these manuscripts that he brought back were actually the ones that were taken from Nalanda when the monks fled to Tibet. That's the point.
Abhay, I want you to briefly tell us, because now we are running very short of time.
Well,
I want you to briefly tell us about the decline of Nalanda, what actually caused it, and what happens when archaeological excavations lead to the rediscovery of Nalanda. What does that do to restore the importance of Nalanda in the public and the influence of Nalanda?
Well, so the Nalanda's decline happened over period of time. So the immediate cause of decline of Nalanda was, of course, the invasion of the Magadha and the central India by Turks from the northwest of India. And Bakhtiyar Khalji is one of the leading characters who not only ransacked Nalanda, but also the Buddhist monasteries of Magadha. And that included the Odantpuri monastery, or Bihar, which is known as Bihar Sharif, which is just 15 kilometers away from Nalanda. But the medium term...
We have a very full account for the ransacking of
Exactly.
Adantapura. We don't have the details, we can only presume, I think.
No, we have an account by
yeah.
the Tibetan monk, Dharma Swami, which is
says-
much later. But you know, I mean, it's improbable that a monastery which is located, most famous, most celebrated
Will not
monastery,
be, yeah.
which is just 15 kilometers away, was spared while Bakhtiyar, ransacked rest of the monastery.
No, I
And
have
he
direct
spared
evidence from
Nalanda.
Tibet. I have
No,
direct
just-
evidence from Tibetan,
Yes,
which
Dharma Swami.
connects, not just Dharma Swami. There's another one, which Dharma Swami doesn't connect Bakhtiyar Khilji directly.
No.
He just says Turushkar raiders, right?
Yes, but just after...
this one,
yeah.
but this one, there's a direct text from Tibetan which connects Bakhtiyar Khilji to the sacking of Nalanda.
And we have signs that there was still sort of activity in the ruins on a much reduced scale.
Yes, so-
there are various later accounts
Correct.
of monks coming, and as late as the 13th century,
Right.
there is a figure who is very prominent at the court of Kublai Khan in Xanadu in Mongolia, who
Dhyanabhadra.
claims to have been ordained in Nalanda.
Early 14th century, actually. So Nalanda survived. Not only Nalanda survived the raids of Bakhtiyar Khalji, but it outlived for almost 140 years the raid. And Nalanda was still a prominent center after the raids, because Nalanda is too large to be destroyed in one or two raids. You have to go and see the ruins of Nalanda today, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But the medium cause decline of Nalanda was the rise of Puranic Brahmanism, where, there's a link between Puranic Brahmanism and Buddhism, actually, because Buddhism itself had become Tantric Buddhism by the end of 10th, 11th century. And the great Madhyamaka school and Yogacara school, for which Xuanzang had come all the way from China, had matured, had become Vajrayana Buddhism, or Tantriana. It's also known as Tantriana. Tantriana also has huge contributions, actually, in many fields, including architecture, three-dimensional mandala architecture, Hatha Yoga, and so many others. But it became indistinguishable from Hinduism. And the third, and which is the most important, even during the Xuanzang's visit to India, the Buddhism was on decline. Even in 7th century, in the northwest, he found ruins all across. It was actually only the Magadha, which had the flourishing Buddhist monasteries. And slow decline over the period of time, over centuries of patronage to Nalanda monastery, but also Buddhist monasteries, led to the final decline and, end of Buddhism, actually, almost end of Buddhism by 14th century in India.
So my last question before I wrap this up is the influence of Nalanda across the centuries, and we see it in the creation of spaces of learning, of planning, of university campuses which are across the world, from Paris to London.
Shall we divide this with me doing
I
the
think both of
architecture
you
and
should
doing
take on
the
this
thought?
question. Yeah?
So this is something both Shailendra and I have been very interested in, and Shailendra's been working on it far longer and has taken it far further than I have. And his book, when it's published next year, is going to be the most astonishing and exciting revelation for us all. But the simple thing that both of us noticed, which is not widely known, is that when you go to Nalanda today, you see a very clear series of courtyards surrounded by a cloister walk, or a cloister garth, as they call it, and with the scholars' rooms on 2 stories above that. Now, if you think of Oxford or Cambridge, that's exactly the plan of any Oxbridge or Harvard college. Now, how is it possible that that plan can have crossed from one side of the world to the other? So the answer is probably, and this is early days in this research, but it seems that, well, we know that Buddhist monasteries spread right across Asia, but particularly as well as going as far as Mongolia and Siberia and Korea and Japan, also up to Central Asia and Bactria. And it is in Afghanistan, in Logar province, arguably, there are many different ways you can pass this, that the very first madrasas of the Islamic world are formed, and they have exactly the same courtyard plan. A courtyard, scholars' rooms, 2 stories. So you can certainly make a case, and there's this wonderful book, Warriors of the Cloister, which both of us have enjoyed with reservations, which makes it Christopher Beckwith, which argues that you have a passage from the cloister plan of Nalanda and other early Buddhist monasteries, perhaps Takshashila too, into the madrasas of Afghanistan, and with Islam through North Africa, through Al-Azhar in Cairo, across the North African coast to the earliest living monastery, the earliest living university in the world is in Tunisia, into Islamic Spain, and then in the 12th century, where do you find the first universities in Western Europe? It is on the borders of Islamic Spain and Islamic Sicily. So Salerno, Bologna, Paris, and then a short gap after that, Oxford and Cambridge, using exactly the same plan. But Shailendra takes this even further and believes that there is reason, I think, that there is intellectual transmission as well.
Yeah. So I'll just take 1 minute because I think your questions are most important. Christopher Beckwith only brings the transmission to bulk, to the Central Asian monasteries. In fact, he argues that it could not have come from India. Christopher Beckwith actually says it could not have come from India, and that is because he makes a blunder, and I have no hesitation in saying that, because that blunder is not his, it is by 2 Russian archaeologists who completely misread the evidence in India, and that's part of my book. But not only that, I'm able to show direct evidence of borrowing from Nalanda. We know the names of people who actually took it there. So just wait for my book. All of it is there. I had to.
In the meantime, you could buy Abhay and I's.
And I'm now opening the floor for whatever time we have left, which is very little, for questions for 3 of these eminent. There. The gentleman standing at the back, yeah. Is there a mic for...
Any mics?
Any mics?
Yeah, production. Here, this gentleman here with the beard. Or give it to Mina, who's got the blue salvar on there.
Yeah.
Here, it's in front of you. And then we get the gentleman with the beard afterwards.
Hi, thank you for the fantastic presentation. I have a quick question. The people who were the monks, was it restricted by caste?
No, there's no evidence of that. Nalanda had this universal admission process where you were asked certain questions by the Dwarpala Pandit, and they certainly did not your caste. It was just your merit.
There is direct evidence. I've looked into this question. There are Shudras, there are Kshatriyas, there are Vaishyas, there are Brahmins, and there are Buddhist monks. All of them basically go there. And equally importantly, the corporate seal of Nalanda says Chaturdisi in Pali, or in Sanskrit Chaturdishi, meaning from all 4 sides. So essentially it meant that everybody from all corners of the world was welcome.
We should add that Xuanzang gives a detailed account of the kind of exam, the oral exam you have to take at the gatehouse before you're admitted. And Xuanzang is very proud because he says, and I was allowed in without having to be questioned. And he makes a big, this is obviously very, very unusual to get in without having to go through this rigorous examination. The other thing we haven't said, which is important, is that it obviously wasn't just for monks from India. Xuanzang was not an exception. We know of monks from Japan, from Korea, from Nepal, from Tibet. We know also, because a copper plate survives, which is now in the National Museum in Delhi, that the kings of Srivijaya, which is modern Indonesia, Java, established a kind of expatriate college there. So rather like you get, the side school of business being founded on the edge of Oxford, you've got an entire Indonesian college founded in Nalanda for expatriate monks.
And that's the beauty of Buddhism. There's no caste there.
So I think at the end of this session, I think what has been driven home is that we can be here for months and days talking about Nalanda because it's a subject that can go on forever. And I think in the interim, while we wait for Dr. Mehta's book to come out, William and Abhay's books are very much available. Thank you all for being here. This was a fabulous session, and thank you to William, Abhay, and Dr. Mehta.